Now, all this week at this time, we're taking a nostalgic look back at the 60s. Love it or hate it, the reverberations of that decade are still being felt. Mrs. Thatcher has blamed the 60s for many of our current social problems. Others believe our lives have become too money-orientated and that we would do well to adopt some of the more spiritual values of that time.
Interesting thoughts. Today we look at the music of the time, and joining us this morning, a real pleasure to say welcome to Ian Anderson of Jethro, Tull and Reg Presley of the Troggs. Reg, of course, lead singer with the Troggs. Their first hit, Wild Thing, do you remember it? One of the great anthems of the decade and still a favourite. Also, Ian Anderson now, Ian, frontman of the legendary Jethro, Tull, a group which came to prominence in the late 60s, became a cult group, still going strong, and actually they've just completed another sellout UK tour. Good morning to both of you.
Morning.
Good morning. Do you object to being wheeled out like dinosaurs? Do you feel dead?
Don't feel that old, really. Do you?
Yeah, I feel terrible, Reg.
Oh, really?
I'm
one of those
bitterly
early
honest
mornings.
about this. Yeah. You look terrific.
I've only seen this.
We actually met in the loo, and neither of us, we looked so awful, neither of us recognised each other.
I don't believe this. I don't believe it. Let's just, Reg, I mean, the beginning for you was actually almost comic, wasn't it? I mean, I know you were involved in music, but one day you're up a roof.
That's
you were
right.
a roofer, weren't you?
No.
What were you?
I was a bricklayer, and I was doing a gable end, and they'd finished a rank of houses, and the painter was on the scaffold the other side, 10 feet away from where I was, and he had a little radio there playing, and I knew that the Wild Thing had charted, but I didn't know where it had got to. And all of a sudden, Wild Thing came on, and this guy shouted across to me, he said, "Have you heard this one?" And I pretended I hadn't, you know, no, So they played it, and they said, "And straight up to number 11 this week." And I went, ah. Down went the trowel, I walked down the ladder, I said, "Share out my tools, lads, I'm off." That was how it happened.
The rest is history, as they say. Actually, Ian, you're a fan of that number. Shall we just... We've got Living in the Past coming up shortly, but you're a fan of Wild Thing?
Yes, it was one of the... Well, the thing about the Troggs, well, they weren't just one of these sort of pretty groups that came out and sort of... I mean, you got the feeling they were actually a live, playing, performing band.
Too right.
There was a rough edge to Wild Thing that made it much better than some of the other things around the time.
Couldn't agree more. Should we just remind ourselves of the punch that was contained in Wild Thing? What a punchy number it is, too. Great stuff, and even the trains ran on time. Yeah. Ian, looking back at the 60s, what were the key differences? Was it simply that there are brand new sounds all over the place, sprouting up like broccoli?
Yes, it was. It was a very creative time. People were not afraid to take risks, and more importantly, record companies weren't afraid to take risks either in promoting and developing new acts. I mean, it was a time when we sort of got to the end of one showbiz period of pop music, you know, with the sort of quietening down of the Cliffs and the Marty Wilds and the kind of previous era of very showbiz-oriented pop music. And it became something else. The promoters, the agents, the record company people were all young, straight out of school, excited about the business, and it created a whole wave of much more creative and exciting sort of mood for everybody.
I mean, even in your classic song, Living in the Past, there was an aggression there. I wonder, is there still an aggression? Is there the same aggression around now, do you think?
Well, Living in the Past is one of the more namby-pamby Jethro Tull songs,
but there's an aggression
course,
within it, isn't there?
Yes, but more so, I think Jethro Tull, you see, has always been known, apart from perhaps in the UK, where more of the acoustic things are popular. A sensitive British audience can understand this stuff. But in America, we're a sort of almost a heavy metal band. Same in Germany.
Yes.
You know, they see us as being much more of a rock band there. So you have to be all things to all people, which of course you can't be. And you did keep changing the set list with amazing rapidity.
you did disgusting things like not miming, didn't you? And you actually you did something really ridiculous. Did you play your own instruments?
I'm afraid we did, actually.
Unforgivable.
Yeah, it was, wasn't it? was the ocarina yours, Reg? Did you play that on Wild Thing?
I didn't actually do that, no, not on the recording. I had to do it parrot fashion, because we were there, and I couldn't actually get it together in the time, but I do it now.
Subsequently learned to do it,
yes.
Yeah.
We're going to chat a lot more later, fellas. Did that gable end get finished? That's the one thing that was worrying me.
No, well, it may have done, but I don't know.
Sod the gable end.
Sod the gable end. I didn't say that, did I? All right, we'll chat more, Reg and Ian, later.
Right now, though, it's time for the weather with Ulrika.
Mick Jagger. Welcome to Ian Anderson, Reg Presley, and our very own Paul Gambaccini. We're talking music. We're talking great music, aren't we? I suppose we should say quickly that we're not just saying that was all great, today is all terrible. We should say that quickly.
No, but what you are saying is the 60s were an absolutely extraordinary decade. As Ian was saying yesterday, 1,000 flowers did bloom, all different sorts of music. You had Motown, you had Stax happening. And you had really almost 3 different parts of the decade. In the pre-beat boom era, you had Elvis at his actual best-selling peak, It's Now or Never, being his top #1 sales in this country. And you had Cliff with amazing success with the Shadows. You had with them the most successful instrumental group in the history of the British charts, the Shadows, and Cliff teaming together on some #1s, having #1s separately. And in one delicious period in early 1963, 5 out of 6 consecutive #1s were by various permutations of Cliff and the Shadows. That's how big they were. I know earlier in the program you mentioned the young ones, Cliff turning 21 just as the film was about to premiere, and I think you have a clip of the song.
The announcer saying, that fabulous young man.
That's right.
I think we see it, can't we? Cliff?
The young ones.
The Shads, young.
And that screaming in the background you heard was Lorraine. With the young ones, Cliff and the Shadows.
There was boy, was there a harsh, vital, energetic new sound as well. People often talk about northern groups, but a lot of southern groups, including our friend here, the Troggs, were making their way, weren't they?
Well, of course, like the Rolling Stones. You know, Ian had a good point while that clip was on, which was at the beginning of the decade, single sales really were important. And although Cliff and the Shadows did top the album charts, nonetheless it was the singles which gave definition to the pop market. The Beatles are the bridge, the hit singles, the hit albums. Then, in the end of the decade, it's the albums that really are the actual cultural milestones. But the Stones, with the Beatles, of course, really the 2 top groups of the entire decade. The Beatles, I know you had the Beatles Week, and the Stones, the alternate to the Beatles, launched in a fanfare of publicity as the Bad Beatles, almost, with Andrew Loog Oldham, their very clever manager, and indeed the cover almost being a snarly takeoff on the Beatles with the Beatles cover. And what their greatest theme, perhaps, is I Can't Get No Satisfaction, almost an anthem of a generation.
Absolutely. I think we can see Satisfaction, one of the great numbers.
That second song is You Better Move On, originally written by Arthur Alexander, and it shows the roots in rhythm and blues of the Rolling Stones. You must remember they began as an R&B group. And in the 60s, there was no segregation on the airwaves between white and black music. Motown, of course, the Tamla sound, so popular. All of the sounds coming from America's South, whether it be Percy Sledge, Wilson Pickett, whatever, Otis Redding. They all were played. It was a glorious melting pot of music, a fabulous time.
And if the skies are blue and you were near the sea, there was only one group, wasn't there?
Well, the Beach Boys. Now, that's America's top singles group in mid-decade, beginning with the surf songs of the early 1960s. And this is astonishing because Brian Wilson, the genius of the Beach Boys, was not a surfer himself. Only one of his brothers actually was. But yet, through words and music, he created a lifestyle which appealed all around the world, even where there was no sea. Absolutely amazing. They had a couple #1s in this country and 3 in America, including one you're about to show, Help Me Rhonda.
It'd be hard to pick one, but here's the one we picked, Help Me Rhonda.
Their music still so enduring and popular. Their album of greatest hits has been in the top 3 in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah.
And it's so special because when you realize that in 1960 we would not have been looking backward at the hits of the 30s. And if you had asked people who the stars of the 30s had been, they might have said Bing Crosby,
Jolson.
And they wouldn't be able to tell you with any accuracy. But yet these artists are still here making music, and of course, as you said earlier, McCartney appearing at Network.
Mainly looking at groups, but there were 1 or 2 individual giants who, well, they're still giants,
of course,
aren't they?
we mentioned Elvis,
yeah.
we mentioned Cliff, and of course, then Bob Dylan comes along, and that's another strand of music which was so important. First of all, as he began the protest music in folk, spreading over to pop. Peter, Paul and Mary had the breakthrough record for him with Blowin' in the Wind. Then he himself emerging as a star of The Times They Are A-Changin' and so many others. And then folk rock coming along with the fusion that the Byrds took to #1 in both sides of the Atlantic with Mr. Tambourine Man. And this great young genius who wrote so many fine songs before he was even 25, in a clip here that you have of him doing his own song of Mr. Tambourine Man.
Here he is.
Hey, Mr. Tambourine Man, play a song for me. In the jingle jangle morning, I'll come following you. Take me on a trip upon your magic swirling ship. My senses have been stripped. My hands can't feel to grip. My toes too numb to step. Wait only for my boot heels to be wandering. I'm ready to go anywhere, I'm ready for to fade into my own parade. Cast your dancing spell my way, I promise to go under it. Mr. Tambourine Man, play a song for me. I'm not sleepy, and there is no place I'm going to.
The genius young poet, Bob Dylan, and you listen to all of that imagery, and you see how he is, in a sense, a bridge between the early 60s and late 60s music, because with his influence on the Beatles, with turning them on to drugs and so forth, and that type of imagery in the lyrics, yes, indeed,
Cool.
yes, indeed, and it leads into the psychedelia of the late 60s, and he really is a bridge between the earlier part of the 60s and the later part of the 60s when Ian emerged.
Of course, Ian Anderson, Reg Presley are with us both this morning. What did you feel? What, if we were to ask you, I know it's quite difficult, what your favourites were of that time? I mean, are you like Paul, a devoted Dylan fan, do you think?
I think that Dylan was very important back then in setting a mood, you know, setting a sort of shift of emphasis towards things that were less afraid to be a bit more precious, a bit more searching, lyrically particularly. But I have to say that I think there's a bit of a con and a bit of tongue-in-cheek about a lot of what Bob Dylan did. And there's also more than a bit of showbiz as well, particularly in sort of...
Well, yes, unfortunately,
years,
as time emerged, he proved not to be such a great innocent. And I know that he did say to one of our show business friends that a lot of what he did actually was a bit of a con, which is a shame, because at the time it seemed to be so absolutely pure. But he knew he was onto a good thing.
But he was having fun.
Oh,
I mean, he was having fun,
Well,
and God bless him. I mean, he gave enduring hope to those of us who really couldn't sing either.
Well, actually,
Who didn't have to have, no, I'm not being entirely rude here, but you didn't,
That's right.
you didn't have to have what was previously considered a tuneful voice.
You had to have a
yeah.
different voice, something, you know, from the next.
that's right, and that's not a facetious point, because prior to that, everyone had to have what was generally considered an acceptable melodic voice, and Dylan just broke that.
There was definitely a north-south divide in the 60s with the Beatles and the sweetness. It was only Lennon's voice that put the rawness into the Beatles, really. But all the rest of the bands, you know, you've got the Stones, the Who, the Kinks, perhaps even us, you know, in that south, making a different kind of aggression, using more aggression. I don't know why at the time, but it was just a... I don't know, we got the aggression from the blues, you know, because they had a lot of problems and everything, and it just worked out in bands, I think,
Well,
you know.
You got it there, Rose. That's where blues was happening, and it's
That's
the only
right.
place in Britain where blues was happening, because we couldn't get arrested anywhere. We were having to play soul music in clubs in the north of England.
That's right.
We had to move to London in order to find a gig, you know, and suddenly the world was open to you. I mean, there were all these clubs in London towards the sort of mid and late 60s, which were like the famous Marquee Club, where the Stones and everybody, including us, really got our first breaks. And you had to come down to London to find the opportunity to use that aggressive sort of blues and
I mean,
R&B approach.
we were listening to the Stones and thinking, where are they getting some of these B-sides? Where? And rummaging through record shops, you know, old record stores, trying to find where they were getting. And by the time we caught up, they'd already gone and made it, you know.
Got the cast
yeah, they
on,
got all the good songs, you know.
Was there a downside to it? I mean, it was also... Well, we know what happened to poor Elvis, the late great Elvis Presley, but there was dangerous... For the first time we learnt there were real dangers to be avoided, particularly those surrounding the pop star. I know you fought hard and successfully and put a big distance between yourselves and drugs and
I
so on.
thought I did, but the absurd thing was, particularly in America, people were still convinced that I was on amphetamines or whatever. I mean, they all just assumed that you had to be, you know, a drug fiend if you were living the rock and roll lifestyle, which none of us in the group ever did. I mean, the guys would come home after a show and sort of read Agatha Christie novels and things, allowed to each other, you know, sort of wearing rubber. But we were basically really normal guys, and that set us apart, unfortunately, from some of our peers at the time who thought we were dreadfully sort of, you know, remote and didn't want to play the game.
Go into a club, you know, even afterwards, a relaxing time, and somebody would come up to you and say, have you got any drugs? And you'd say, no. Do you want some? You know, you were sort of
It was a case
confronted with it all the time.
For some
you know,
time, Ian, do you remember we all said, oh, he's the guy, oh, he's the farm. You know, it seemed extraordinary to be on a farm. Nobody could understand that you were sane, you know. We haven't mentioned a rather famous group.
Oh, yes, we haven't. I think we should. Let's have a look back. Let's have a look back and mention the world's most famous band, I suppose. Here they are.
The Beatles. Extraordinaire, and of course, great numbers there, but Ian, you have been followed. It lives in your wardrobe, it follows you everywhere, living in the past.
Yes, it does a bit, doesn't it?
Which indicates that you haven't written anything else, which is considering you have, what, 27... How many albums have you done?
I think it's probably about 22, something like that.
You brought your flute.
Yes, I have, which is a
you're
terrible thing to
flautist.
do to me this time of the morning, because the flute player, as you know, has to get his embouchure in shape.
I should have brought my ocarina. We could have worked together.
We could
maybe
have had a live
indeed.
concert here, couldn't we? That would have been rather good. What,
But as a song, that particular one was a very contrived, deliberate attempt to actually get a single. It was the one and only time that we ever actually went in the studio and said, right, we must do something as a single. And we were in fact away on our first American tour at the time, trying to make it big over there, leaving the UK market behind, and we're told, you know, while you're away, if you can get something just to sort of keep the bubble, you know, keep the pot boiling, as it were, while you're away. So we went into the studio and just did this quickie thing, albeit in 5/4 time, which was not the most commercial sort of starting point for a song, and whacked it out, as they say, you know, in a little 8-track studio somewhere near New York, and shipped the tapes back to Britain, and off it went. But it's a bit of an embarrassment, because I don't think it's really quite what Jethro Tull felt like on the inside, and indeed to a lot of Jethro Tull's fans, isn't really typical of the music. However, it was the one that, I suppose, brought us to the attention of the broader masses and got us a couple of the pops at a time when
very rude and
spotty, pimply, unattractive people such as ourselves and Peter Green of Fleetwood Mac were not supposed to do top of the pops, you know.
can we risk a few notes of living in the past?
Yeah,
Is
well,
that possible? do you think?
of living in the past.
Can
Yeah.
you try
Well,
it? It's a difficult one for you to do.
there's sort of 3 ways of playing the
Yeah.
flute. I mean, one, you can, you know, play just straight notes, but the way I developed playing the flute to try and cut through the noise of very loud electric guitars and all the rest of it was to sing in unison, which is a... Okay, so that's singing and playing the same note, but that's just a bit loud, isn't it? Sorry.
No.
Waking people up, including my wife, who won't be thanking me for this. But then, living in the past actually was singing and playing in harmony. Which was the, if you like, the third approach.
Wonderful.
Nice.
Absolutely wonderful.
Isn't
Well,
that
we
restful?
are unashamedly living in the past, aren't we? But you two still touring, still selling lots, aren't you? You sell how many?
Well, we
albums?
seem to shift about 1 million albums every year,
Well,
still.
can't be
Bearing
bad.
in mind
And
lot of
winning a
that's the
Grammy
old
Award
stuff.
last year.
And we're still trying.
And then, and he's still worrying about that roof in Andover when we first started. Good to meet both of you. Thanks for reflecting the past and indeed the future with us.
Thanks
Ian
very
and
much.
Reg. And Gambo, as ever.
See you Wednesday.
Thank you to you.
Shall we take a break now?
Quick break.